A series of unfortunate events is definitely one of the most unique children's series out there, and of course, let's be honest, it's also pretty morbid. But what really added to the whole intrigue of the series was all of the secrets, mysteries, and shadowy organizations that created this deliciously dark atmosphere. So the problem was that by the end of the series, and even by the end of the prequel series, many of these secrets were never answered. Now, I covered the history of the series in a previous video, but today I wanted to do something a little bit different and dive head first into this tangled web of theories and conspiracies and see if we can unravel some of them. So today we'll be using the Iceberg style format to explore the secrets and theories of a series of unfortunate events. Hi everyone, my name is Otto, and this is Exits Examined. We'll be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. Now, this is my first Iceberg-style video and different from my usual content, but if people like it, I might do more on other series. Anyway, if that all sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below. Now, I want to get a few bits and pieces of housekeeping out of the way up front. Basically, some of these are theories and points we could easily spend hours on themselves. Now, I tried to get a good amount of detail for all of these, but to keep this massive video from being too insanely long, I had to keep things manageable. If you're interested in diving into some more of these theories yourself, I highly recommend the Snicket Sleuth Tumblr, which was an invaluable resource when writing this, and many of these theories are based on their research. Also, just to be extremely upfront and manage expectations, many of these are theories and not complete definitive answers, and that's just the way it is with this series. I view many of these as kind of starting points or jumping off points because there just simply aren't clear answers for a lot of these. Okay, so there's so much to go over, so let's not waste any more time. And obviously massive spoilers for all of the series in the VFT universe, so be warned. All right, let's get started. The fate of the Baudelaire fortune. The Baudelaire fortune seemingly was a catalyst for almost all the terrible things that happened in the series. When we meet Violet, Klaus, and Sonny Baudelaire, their parents have been murdered in a suspicious fire, leaving them the heirs of an enormous fortune. Throughout the series, the dastardly Count Olaf pursues them to the literal ends of the earth to get his hands on it. Now, this makes more sense because some readers have speculated with some math that the Baudelaires are quite literally billionaires. But at the end of the series, what even is the fate of this enormous fortune? You might think, well, obviously it's still being kept for them at the bank until the children come of age, but actually it's not quite that simple. By the end of the series, the children are wanted criminals, and the person in charge of their fortune, Mr. Poe, is MIA, and don't worry, we'll talk about him much more later. But anyway, on top of all of that, there actually is a compelling theory that the fortune has been stolen, and not by Count Olaf as you might expect. Mrs. Bass was the seemingly innocent math teacher, but was later apprehended for bank robbery. Now, interestingly, there are some other data points. One, that Mr. Poe, who was in charge of the Baudelaire's estate, was sent to investigate a bank robbery, which hints that Mrs. Bass's robbery was somehow intertwined with the Baudelaire fortune. And this is further reinforced when the bags that she was carrying was described as, quote, bulky bags with the words property of Mortuary Money Management stamped on them, which is the same place that the Baudelaire's estate was held. Now, this is not the last time we're going to talk about the Baudelaire fortune, but speaking of numbers, let's move on. The number 3. Now, obviously the number 13 comes up a lot in the series, but beyond that, the number 3 seems to be something of a recurring motif in the series. From the obvious 3 Baudelaire orphans to the more subtle, like the amount of words in a code or the amount of words in the name of a certain society. And more, it's a pattern that demands attention. The 3 Snickets, the 3 Dumonts, the 3 Quagmires, and another group of siblings which we'll mention later. And we have to ask, what is the significance here? Well, 3 is an important number in history, echoing through religions, philosophies, and real-life secret societies. It's a cornerstone of symbolism, often representing completion, unity, or the divine. Regardless of what exactly it means in the series, it's undoubtable that it carries significance in this universe. How much time actually passes in the series? Now, something I never really considered when I first read the books is how much time actually passes in a series of unfortunate events. It's pretty vague, and the TV show even makes fun of how open-ended this time frame actually is. You might think that it's just a few weeks, but there's actually quite a strong case for it being much longer. So, for example, Sonny's language skills alone suggest a significant amount of time has passed. She goes from babbling to being pretty articulate by the end of the series. And there are even more clues hidden throughout the books. For example, in the end, there's a direct quote mentioning that no castaways have arrived on the island in a year, so we know that the children were there for at least that amount of time. There's a great Tumblr post with a detailed breakdown, which I'll link below, but from what I can gather, most people agree that the series spans about 2 years, which is way longer than I thought originally. Is Lemony Snicket real? Now, it's wild to think about the early days of a series of unfortunate events. When the books first came out, people genuinely believed Lemony Snicket was a real person, and the fake photos, newspaper clippings, and VFD stuff really sold it. With the limited internet back then, it was really hard to fact check a lot of this, and this was all sold heavily by Daniel Handler, the actual author, who played the part of Snicket's representative extremely hard. I mean, if you saw interviews of him at the time, you got to give him credit. Now, of course, we now know that Handler is the author, but it's interesting to think that for a good part of the series, most people didn't have a clue, and it was probably a huge draw of the series in the first place. What does cake sniffer even actually mean? Okay, so obviously a cake sniffer is someone who sniffs cakes. But why is that an insult? I mean, cake smells good. One theory is that it may refer to expensive things that the Baudelaires can no longer afford, so all they can do is kind of sniff cake from a distance, which, okay, weird. But this is actually reinforced by the saying, "let them eat cake," which the Baudelaires do hear in their journey. The TV show goes a bit more into this actually. Carmelita, who seems to be the originator of this phrase, sneaks into the school's kitchens at night to smell cakes. So basically, she's just projecting her guilt onto others. And actually, when Duncan calls her a cake sniffer, he's basically saying, "I know your secret and I'm not afraid to use it," which is why she's so quick to go away. When and where was the series actually set? One of the most interesting aspects about a series of unfortunate events is that it unfolds in this world that seems timeless. It has many elements from the 19th century, like Morse codes, but then sometimes they'll just be advanced computers or fiber optic cables, and it kind of throws everything you knew out the window. Now, adding to this confusion, there's also elements from different cultures, and apparently Snicket named the Baudelaires as he did, Klaus, Violet, and Sunny, apparently because they were all names from different countries for exactly this reason. But then also there's just strange things that don't even match up with the world as we know it, like mentions of, quote, the King of Arizona, and I've seen it described as familiar but also bizarre, which fits quite nicely in my opinion. So when asked about this, basically where and when the series is set, Handler has this to say: "A series of unfortunate events takes place in the city and regions surrounding it, during the week and sometimes on weekends. All the Wrong Questions takes place earlier in a smaller town." So helpful, right? Now, it's clear that the series is set in a different world, or maybe even different timeline from our own, which would explain the mishmash of technology and styles. But as far as where it is, I'm happy that I can report we actually know, well, kind of know where the world is. It's called the Lands of Districts, and it's a large area encompassing where the series takes place, and presumably staying by the sea, which featured in the prequel series All the Wrong Questions. On an official photo given of the Hotel Dumont stationery, the number listed below the logo is actually a San Francisco number, implying that the city may be near San Francisco, or at least a version of America. In the books, though, it's pretty deliberately kept vague. The Pony Party is real. The Pony Party is the famous first book in the Luckiest Kids in the World series, written by Lemony M. Setnick, and it's about the 3 luckiest kids in the world. Okay, I love that this exists, and basically the Pony Party is kind of an Easter egg. It's the reverse cover to disguise Lemony Snicket, the unauthorized autobiography. But what's really interesting about this is that it's in universe, it's canon, like it exists, and in the Netflix adaptation, the book can actually be seen throughout the series. Most prominently, we see that Mr. Poe himself is a fan of the book, which is probably why he's so cheerful. Aunt Josephine's fears are all rational. Ah, Aunt Josephine, lover of grammar and terrified of almost everything else. Now, in The Wide Window, Lemony describes her fears as irrational because some of them, like realtors, seem a bit random. But the more we learn about her background and the secret organization known as VFD, the less irrational these fears seem to be. I mean, we get first-hand accounts of VFD causing murders, thefts, and of course arson. So is it any wonder Josephine, a known member of VFD and grieving widow, was so afraid? So let's look at some of these phobias one by one. The lachrymose leeches, which I personally think is pretty irrational given their terrifying ability to eat you alive. Drowning, which I also think is a pretty rational fear. Realtors, which given both sides of VFD's training with disguises makes total sense to me. And finally, stoves, radiators, rugs, sofa. Well, all of those sound super flammable to me. And given VFD's history with fire, this doesn't surprise me that she's afraid of these. So actually, when taking all of this into consideration, Aunt Josephine might have been in fact one of the more rational characters in the series. Family connections within the members of VFD. Now, one thing that might have escaped some people on a first read is just how interconnected the families are within VFD. Just take, for example, how Olaf is apparently either a fourth cousin 3 times removed or a third cousin 4 times removed of the Baudelaire children. Beyond that, the Baudelaires and all the other families, the Snickets, Quagmires, and so on, it can be a huge rabbit hole to go down. Take the Snickets. Now, you might notice in this family tree, 90% of these names are not names, they're just letters, which leads to gigantic speculation on who is who, even just within this small branch of the VFD. Let's just take M. Snicket as an example. Now, some people theorize that this person could in fact be Uncle Montgomery, but that's kind of difficult to confirm. Now, other people theorize that all the families in VFD are interconnected and related, but most of them seem to be related very distantly and sometimes only in a legal sense. For instance, speaking of Montgomery, he's apparently related to Bertrand, but not actually of blood relation. Then there's all these weird similarities in all of the families, which would explain the unusually high number of unibrows in the series, like with Count Olaf, and if you start digging into it, there's even more of these connections. Quote, Count Olaf, Aunt Josephine said, is a terrible man who is standing right in front of us, Violet finished. I don't care what he calls himself, he has the same shiny eyes and the same single eyebrow. But plenty of people have those characteristics, Aunt Josephine said. Why, my mother-in-law had not only one eyebrow, but also only one ear. Now, speaking of Aunt Josephine and these weird similarities, let's also talk about Ike and Beatrice, who could both whistle with crackers in their mouth, which is an insanely specific thing to do, right? And maybe like they learned it from someone in the same family. So to tie all of this together, there's no outright mention of direct relations between some of these families, like the Snickets and Baudelaires, but there are definitely some interesting connections going on within the prominent families in VFD. What happened to the white-faced women? Okay, so remember when I was talking about the series' obsession with 3? Well, did you know that the white-faced women actually had a third sister? Now, for those of you who need a refresher, they were members of Count Olaf's acting troupe and helped him in his dastardly schemes. Well, after refusing to throw Sonny off a mountain, they quit Count Olaf's troupe, and their fate is left very vague. But before they leave, they revealed some really interesting information. Quote, no, we mean no. We're done participating in your schemes. We lost our parents and our home in a fire. We're starting to think that it wasn't a coincidence. We lost our sister too. So this is another fire in a long series of fires throughout the books. And reading this passage, it's kind of hinted that Olaf might have been responsible. Now, as far as what happened to the women, Lemony admits to being in the dark about their fate, saying that some claim to have seen them wandering around, while others say they went to the hinterlands or even escaped to the mountains. In the TV series, they are shown to at least get a happy ending. They become successful members of an acting troupe. Man with a beard but no hair, and the woman with hair but no beard. The man with a beard but no hair, and the woman with hair but no beard, together known as the Sinister Duo, are super mysterious figures who loom large in the shadowy corners of the VFD world. So to put this into perspective, even the primary antagonist in the series, who the children fear above all else, Count Olaf, is pretty weary when approaching them, and that should give you an idea of just how terrifying these two people actually are. So this all begs the question, who are they? Well, their names are obviously never revealed, but we do get a few interesting hints. They do seem to be high-ranking members in the VFD, and the duo had regular occupations as high court judges, and they used this to gain information on the Baudelaire case. It's heavily implied that their schemes are on a far higher level and more sinister level than that of Olaf's, and it's obvious they are no strangers to arson or murder. And I personally love their additions in the stories. It shows us that we're only seeing a small sliver or fraction of this world, and all the evil schemes from Olaf and his troop are just a tiny, tiny part of the world, and it just really puts things in perspective. As far as their identity, there's been some speculation that they are in fact some of the minor antagonists from the prequel All the Wrong Questions, and the timing would make sense. And after all, these antagonists were members of the VFD. As far as their fates, we'll get to that a bit later. The Quagmire's fate. Now, I was always super fascinated by the Quagmires in the novels. They were always just kept mysterious enough for me to be wondering what was happening to them, and they were always at the fringes, and it was always kind of left ambiguous to what was really going on, and it just got my imagination going wild. And of course, their eventual fates were no less ambiguous. So first of all, where exactly did we see them last? Duncan and Isadora were in Hector's self-sustaining hot air mobile home when eagles sent by the fire starters of VFD, basically the bad guys of VFD, attacked their airship. In the end, Kit claims that Quigley in a helicopter fought off the eagles when the balloon dropped on the Queequeg, where Captain Wittershins and Fiona were on board. Apparently, the Great Unknown came, and Kit, unable to convince the others to escape with her, assumes that this massive entity either saved or killed the rest of them. She doesn't know. Fascinatingly enough, Lemony gives a different version of events involving the battles with the eagles, so it's not clear if Kit is a reliable narrator here. As far as the final word we get on the Quagmires, this is what was said. They were in, quote, circumstances just as dark, although quite a bit damper than theirs, end quote. Now, I don't want to leave you there, and according to the TV canon at least, it's hinted that things are a bit more optimistic. So as evidence of this, it is implied through a secret message in the incomplete history of secret organizations, an utterly unreliable account of Netflix's A Series of Unfortunate Events, that the Quagmires reunited with Violet, Klaus, and Sunny on Briny Beach sometime after the end, which would fit nicely in with what we know about Violet returning a third time in her life to Briny Beach. Everyone died at the hotel. At the end of the penultimate peril, the hotel was set on fire by the Baudelaires as a signal to VFD that the last safe place is safe no more, and to delay Count Olaf from unleashing the deadly bioweapon Medusoid mycelium in the hotel lobby, which could have easily spread to the entire city if left unchecked. Okay, but let's back up 1 minute. Who was actually in the hotel? Well, we have a pretty comprehensive list of people, including Mr. Poe, Justice Strauss, Sir, Charles, Vice Principal Nero, Carmelita, Esme, Jerome, the Sinister Duo, and the Dumonts, to name just a few. And we do get some pretty concrete details on at least a few of these characters. Quote, "I don't know who to believe," Esme said scornfully. "You orphans are as dishonest as my ex-boyfriend." "Leave us alone," Carmelita ordered, bumping into a wall. "We can find our own way." The doors slid shut before the Baudelaires could argue any further, and indeed, the children never argued with either unpleasant female again. The elevator doors closed before Mr. Poe could finish his word, and the Baudelaires were taken away from the banker one last time. Now, these seem pretty cut and dry that these characters probably didn't have a happy ending, but we can infer some more information based on where we saw each character last. For example, the Sinister Duo was last seen in the lobby of the hotel, and given their proximity to the exit as well as their experiences with fire, it's unfortunately very possible that they survived. On the other side of things, given that Esme and Carmelita were last seen heading to the literal source of the fire, things are probably not looking too good for them. Now, 10 years later, we do get reports that Lemony has a hunch that Esme Squalor might actually be pretending to be Beatrice in the Beatrice letters, which would be crazy. But if he's right, it means that Esme is alive and well 10 years later. Or at least that's what he thinks. Given the fact that he doesn't mention many of these other characters at the hotel ever again, it does not bode well for them. And it's very possible that the simplest answer is that they all in fact died in the fire. The cycle of violence. A central theme in a series of unfortunate events is the cyclical nature of violence and its destructive impact. This is most explicitly conveyed in Olaf's final moments, where he references a poem. And wow, I did not read the entire poem the first time I read the books, but I did it on a reread, and holy cow, it's intense. Now, here are a few sections of it. They f you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. This really highlights the series as a tangled web of revenge. It's basically a case of Olaf striking back at the Baudelaires after the Baudelaire parents murdered Count Olaf's parents, which is heavily implied. So Olaf's relentless pursuit of the Baudelaire children is a form of revenge, and maybe it was never even about the fortune in the first place. But there is a bright spot in here, and at the end, the Baudelaire children seem to break this cycle. By adopting Beatrice II, they choose compassion over hatred, and this really offers some hope against the overwhelming depression and tragedy in the series. But that may be going a step too far, because we haven't talked about the Baudelaire's eventual fate, which I'm sorry to keep repeating myself, but we'll get to that later. Who started the Quagmire fire? Now, there were many fires mentioned in the series, and one of the most prominent ones was, of course, the Quagmire fire. So what actually happened here? Well, we do have a first-hand account. What we know is that the fire began when the family was at home. Quigley was in the library and heard a shattering of glass and people shouting. His mother ran to him to warn him about the fire, but after the front door was blocked by smoke, she hid him inside a secret passage while she left to go find his siblings. Quigley heard the house falling apart and the sounds of screams, so yeah, pretty terrible stuff. So the Quagmire parents died in the fire, and their fortune in the form of the Quagmire sapphires was left to the surviving children. Now, interestingly, there are implications that Snicket was blamed for the Quagmire fire, and this is why he's on the run from the authorities during the series of unfortunate events. Now, the real motives behind the fire still remains a bit of a mystery. One possibility is that it was all about the Quagmire sapphires, although these gems were supposedly secured in a safe place before the children could inherit them. Alternatively, the fire could have been an act of revenge against the Quagmire parents, and possibly all linking back to the VFD schism. Some people think that Olaf was behind it, but I think a more compelling suspect is Esme Squalor, who stood to gain control of the Quagmire estates. But just like with many things in this universe, the jury is still out, as they would say. I'd also be remiss and fail as my duties in a reporter if I didn't mention another theory that points the blame at Dr. Orwell. And there's an entire video on this by a YouTuber, which I'll link below. Kit was stealing the sugar bowl in All the Wrong Questions. So in the prequel series, All the Wrong Questions, Lemony and Kit had a secret mission. They planned to sneak into a museum through a hidden VFD tunnel under the unfinished fountain of victorious finance. Their goal was to steal a mysterious item, something that the museum hadn't seen in over 84 years. Now, many fans think that they were trying to grab the sugar bowl. If that's true, it could mean that the museum itself was linked to VFD. We know that the organization was already on the verge of a schism at this point in the timeline, which has some interesting implications that all of this was happening at the same time and might have even been a catalyst for it. Who started the Baudelaire fire? Oh boy, this is one of the big ones, and it's going to get pretty messy, but yeah, who set the fire at the Baudelaire mansion? Well, for starters, the most obvious would of course be Count Olaf. After all, he was the one who hated the Baudelaires the most and had the most to gain as far as getting the children into his evil clutches. He loved starting fires. There was a fire at the Baudelaires. Simple, right? He could kill two birds with one stone, get his revenge on the parents, and take the fortune. Well, let's take it straight from the horse's mouth. Quote, Klaus knelt down beside his sister and stared into the villain's shiny eyes. "You're the one who made us orphans in the first place," he said, uttering out loud for the first time a secret all three Baudelaires had kept in their hearts for almost as long as they could remember. Olaf closed his eyes for a moment, grimacing in pain, and then stared slowly at each of the three children in turn. "Is that what you think?" he said finally. "We know it," Sonny said. "You don't know anything," Count Olaf said. "You three children are the same as when I first laid eyes on you. You think you can triumph in this world with nothing more than a keen mind, a pile of books, and the occasional gourmet meal." He poured one last gulp of cordial into his poisoned mouth before throwing the seashell into the sands. "You're just like your parents." So this is very interesting how ambiguous this is. From what we know about Olaf, he likes to brag, so he probably would have just admitted it here. And even if he didn't, we probably would have heard this in a conversation that was overheard. In this scene though, where he's dying, he has nothing to lose, so why not tell him? It's not like him to not brag about it if he did. Now also, we have to consider the timing. We know that the Baudelaire's parents and Olaf were enemies way before Violet was even born, so why would Olaf wait so long to get revenge? And taking this a step further, how could the Baudelaire parents think it was safe to live in the same city as this crazy guy? I think the answer is probably because they knew he wouldn't dare to do anything. And this could possibly tie back to the Sugar Bowl. Maybe Olaf couldn't act until he could confirm the whereabouts of the Sugar Bowl. So going down this rabbit hole, in the extra The Dismal Dinner, we actually get some more insight into what was happening in the Baudelaire mansion pretty much right before the fire. Well, if you uncode a secret message in this extra, it turns out that Olaf was there, maybe as they say to case the joint. There were also a few mentions of a sugar bowl, and this is super important. Now, taking this even a step further, some people think that the Baudelaire parents staged all of this to lure Olaf to the house so they could arrest him there, and they sent the children away that day to the beach for this exact reason. So many levels here, right? But as with any investigation, it's important not to get tunnel vision, and we should look at other suspects. Well, what about Esme? She hated the Baudelaires for stealing her sugar bowl, and she could easily get into the mansion through that secret tunnel from the apartment at 667 Dark Avenue. And there is strong evidence that she married Jerome for the sole purpose to get access to that tunnel. Okay, but hang on, because we're going to get super conspiracy theory here. Some people speculate that the Baudelaire parents set the fire themselves. They were in trouble at the time of the fire. The net was closing in, and maybe they thought the only way to protect their kids was to cause a fire. They knew someone was after them because of the sugar bowl, and they thought the kids would be safer with Uncle Monty where they were originally supposed to go. But if this is the case, they caused the exact thing they were trying to stop. The Great Unknown. The Great Unknown is one of the great mysteries of the series, and what we know is that it is a large, entity that roams the sea and roughly has a question mark shape. In the original series, this was left pretty open-ended as to what this actually is, and many people think that it's more of an idea than anything else. But with all things in this universe, it's not that simple, so buckle up. So in the prequel series, in All the Wrong Questions, we get some more answers on this. Well, maybe. We get introduced to the Abominating Beast, which was a mythological sea monster that lurked in the waters outside the town of Staying by the Sea. It was known to eat humans and made buzzing sounds while hunting. Now, this original one was allegedly killed, but within All the Wrong Questions, basically more are recreated by the ends, and it's unknown how many actually survived. Now, only one was noted to have reached adulthood, and many people think that this Abominating Beast and the Great Unknown are one in the same. And in fact, on the wiki, they're literally the same page. This is further hinted at in the TV series, where it's confirmed that the entity in question is a sea monster. So great, case closed, right? Well, I don't know. I'm personally not totally convinced. And the reason for this is that in the Grim Grotto, the Great Unknown is picked up by sonar, which, given how sonar works, doesn't really imply that it's a living creature and could in fact mean that it's a submarine. More evidence against the Abominating Beast equals the Great Unknown is Kit was there at the end of All the Wrong Questions and was extremely familiar with what the Abominating Beast was. And if she knew this during a series of unfortunate events, she could have just told everyone that it's a giant monster instead of being so vague about it, and this could have in fact actually saved a lot of people's lives. But if we take a step back, in a more meta sense, one theory about the Great Unknown is that it's simply a metaphor for death, and I don't think we're really supposed to feel confident in knowing exactly what the Great Unknown is. After all, it's right there in the name itself. Who is the kind editor? remember, you are my last hope that the tales of the Baudelaire orphans can finally be told to the general public. The mysterious kind editor is the unseen hand behind a series of unfortunate events. They're responsible for collecting Lemony Snicket's often troubled manuscripts and somehow turn them into a published book, so probably one of the more underappreciated and difficult jobs out there. But all this begs the question, why? Given Snicket's insistence on the series' depressing tone and the editor's seemingly endless troubles, just read the letters at the end of each book, it's kind of hard to imagine any profit motive. This raises some pretty intriguing questions. Is the kind editor part of VFD, and what do they hope to gain from this seemingly thankless and very difficult task? So a lot of people think that one of the more important characters from the prequel series, All the Wrong Questions, Moxie, is the mysterious kind editor. They were, after all, close friends in that series, and Moxie was an experienced writer. However, by the end, their relationship did seem to be strained. To add to this mystery, Snicket claimed in a 2015 interview that he hasn't seen Moxie since the events of All the Wrong Questions. So while she's a strong possibility, the full story remains shrouded in mystery. The fate of the Baudelaires. The end of the end is left painfully ambiguous, and it definitely made a ton of people wonder what exactly became of the Baudelaires. So to give a refresher, after the Baudelaires help Kit give birth to a baby girl and name that baby after their mother, they spend a good amount of time on the island before deciding to sail away and go back to the outside world. The final illustration depicts a question mark, or maybe it's the great unknown within the ocean, and the Baudelaire's fate is very uncertain. But if we dig a bit deeper, we find a coded sentence in the Beatrice letters, which gives us a bit of an answer. But unfortunately, this answer may not be the one that you want. Their ship, the Beatrice, sank, and there's even an illustration of the destroyed boat and the kids' belongings. But despite that, and more importantly, the actual fate of the children is never fully revealed. So let's dig into it. We know that their foster daughter, Beatrice II, somehow survived, and if a baby could live through a shipwreck, it's definitely not impossible that the Baudelaire children did as well, given all the other crazy situations they got out of. There are also more hints than this, with Klaus in particular. Quote, Klaus would lie awake in bed years later thinking that maybe, just maybe, if he had acted in time, he could have saved Uncle Monty's life. So yeah, that makes it pretty likely that he survived for years later. As far as Violet, there are actually hints, with Lemony speaking of a third time she went to Briny Beach, and in the books we only see her there twice, implying that she survived. And Sunny too seems also likely, because she's mentioned to have been featured on the radio after the series ended. Now, if we take this theory one step further, we can speculate that maybe the reason Lemony ended it where he did is because he wanted them to be dead. So let me explain that. By the end of the 13th book, Lemony is kind of a broken man. His pursuit of the Baudelaires led him to their final known location, only to discover that they pretty much vanished. This heartbreaking revelation is compounded by the tragic loss of his sister. And on top of this, the Baudelaires are fugitives at this point. So if he's writing the only public accounts of their lives and truly wants what's best for them, exposing their secrets could endanger their fragile new beginnings. And out of all the people who deserve a fresh start, the Baudelaires certainly did. What started the schism? The schism was the catalyst that divided VFD, with one side trying to put out fires, while the other side, the fire starters, well, starting fires. Now, this really is at the heart of the series of unfortunate events, and a big reason why so many unfortunate events happen in the Baudelaire's lives are indirectly caused by this. But what actually caused it in the first place? Well, there are a few theories. Some claiming that it was Beatrice who stole the sugar bowl from Esme, or maybe it was the murder of Count Olaf's parents, or maybe it was just a simple disagreement in how to put out fires. Unfortunately, very little is actually known, except roughly when it started, with Kit specifying that she was 4 at the time of the schism. But it gets a bit more confusing than that, because the schism apparently happened in sections or maybe waves, with multiple characters alluding that the schism, quote, worsens with each generation. Now, in the Netflix canon, the schism happened during the night at the opera, but this cannot be true in the books because as we've mentioned, Kit was 4 at the time of the schism, so the timelines just don't match up. So unfortunately, things are still left a bit open-ended. Beatrice survived. Okay, so here's a theory I love. What if Beatrice didn't actually die in the Baudelaire fire? Kinda crazy, but hear me out. There's a strong possibility that she actually survived the fire by hiding in the secret passage between her house and 667 Dark Avenue. Lemony later drops a pretty big hint when he mentions the fickle fountain and how things can be hidden inside it. Quote, I imagine the damp surroundings of a fountain's innards would be comforting if the person hiding inside had recently survived a fire. Plus, the description of the fountain's innards being comforting might suggest she was injured and sought refuge there to cool her burns. Also, when the children emerge out of the tunnel from 667 Dark Avenue into the ashes of their home, a person thinks they're ghosts and says that everyone always thought the place is haunted, and now they know it's true. So the question is, why would everyone say that unless another quote-unquote ghost had previously been seen arising from the ashes? Now, remember when Lemony sees Beatrice at one of the Duchess's masked balls? Given the timeline, this easily could have been after the Baudelaire fire. So the theory goes that Beatrice survived the first fire, but perished tragically in the one at the Duchess's palace. In fact, the Duchess mentions losing belongings in a fire after the ball, and even includes a picture of a young girl, implied to be Beatrice, calling her flammable. Now, this is one of those theories that, if it is true, I'm happy that it's never really confirmed or expounded upon in the universe, because if it is true, this would be heartbreaking for the children, and in a series as dark as this, do we really need any more terrible things happening? The trip to Peru was the start of VFD training. Uncle Monty, everyone's favorite herpetologist. Well, it's easy to miss this on a first read, but it's a bit suspicious just how quickly Monty wants the children to go on the Peru trip with him. And there's a theory that the reason Monty doesn't want them to stay in his home for long is because he plans to get them started on their VFD training ASAP. And this makes more sense with what we know about the VFD training. Quote, we are entering people's homes, taking young children who show exceptional observational and note-taking skills, and isolating them for long periods, at least from people they know. We assign them to strangers and scatter them across the globe, performing errands that are perplexing to them until their ankles have healed, until we know they can be trusted, and until we know that no one is searching for them any longer. Then, finally, we bring them to headquarters so they can learn the skills they need before they are introduced back into society. Seems strangely familiar, right? The fact that Monty rushed the Baudelaires off as soon as they arrived is pretty suspicious, and all the more so when you realize that both sides of the VFD schism seemed really interested in the children. Maybe they saw something special in the Baudelaires and they thought they would make valuable agents. Mr. Poe. Mr. Poe is one of the most infuriating characters in the series, arguably even more responsible for the children's misfortunes than even Count Olaf. And his incompetence is the primary driver for many of the things that happen. But on repeat reads, we have to ask, is this incompetence or is this something more sinister? First of all, even his cough is a little suspicious. Now, some people have read this as a simple reference to the man he was named after, Edgar Allan Poe, but what if it was a bit more dark than that? What if Mr. Poe was coughing all the time because of his involvement and proximity to fires? Well, it's not far off to assume that there's something suspicious and confusing in Mr. Poe's behavior. For example, take the inconsistencies with him handling the Baudelaire family will. Case in point for this is, how did the children end up with Count Olaf in the first place? Because Uncle Monty, Aunt Josephine, and even potentially the Snickets seemed far more likely candidates than Count Olaf, and certainly more in line with what their parents wanted. Now, Mr. Poe waved this away by saying, quote, your parents' will, Mr. Poe said, instructs that you be raised in the most convenient way possible. Here in the city, you'll be used to your surroundings, and this Count Olaf is the only relative who lives within the urban limits. Okay, sure, but if that's the case, what about Jerome? He was in the city closer to their parents, and even says he would have done it if he was asked. So really suspicious. And the obvious conclusion that we can make from all of this is that Mr. Poe had to be working with Count Olaf. But we see multiple examples of not only Mr. Poe standing as an obstacle to Count Olaf, but actively trying to stop him, and it wouldn't make sense if they're working together. So here's what we have. Mr. Poe clearly wanted the Baudelaire kids to have a normal life with good guardians, but he kept picking terrible ones. He hated Olaf and tried to get him locked up, but it was Poe who put the kids in his care in the first place. On top of that, he was always super strict about the money, saying they couldn't touch a penny until Violet turned 18, which would have saved them from so much trouble if they just had access to it. So it's all super confusing and doesn't make much sense. And actually, writing this, I feel like I'm almost right back to where I started at the beginning of this section, and maybe he is just incompetent. But in this world of secrets and mysteries, there does seem to be something more sinister and devious at play here that we just haven't found out yet. Beatrice II is Olaf's child. The relationship between Olaf and Kit Snicket is one of the most interesting aspects of the series. Now, they've obviously had some pretty intense history, and they have been confirmed love interest, and this idea that Olaf is actually the father of Beatrice II has some pretty interesting ramifications. That being said, the established timeline, coupled with Kit's possible involvement in the deaths of Olaf's parents, creates some significant barriers to this theory. On top of this, Olaf's complete lack of awareness or suspicion about this kind of undermines its credibility as well. However, there is an undeniable connection between these two characters, marked both by love and hate. And personally, I kind of love the irony of the Baudelaires raising their worst enemy's child. But as fun as this theory is, there is strong evidence provided by the series that leans heavily against this possibility, with Dewey most likely being the father. What does the S stand for? S. Theodora Markson is a VFD chaperone. Lemony Snicket was assigned under her in All the Wrong Questions. Ranked last out of 52 VFT chaperones, Theodora is the least successful chaperone available for trainees, but despite this, Lemony intentionally chose her as his mentor. But she also has some secrets of her own. Throughout the series, the S in her name remains mysterious, and whenever Lemony asks her, she replies with different words and never reveals her true name. There are a few theories, but I think the most interesting and plausible seems to come to light when we take into consideration Theodora's other apprentice. Throughout All the Wrong Questions, Theodora frequently bemoans how Lemony is much worse than her last apprentice, who turned out to be none other than Bertrand Baudelaire, who is of course the father of the Baudelaire orphans. So keep that in mind. Now, following up with that, we know that within the Baudelaire family, it's a family tradition to name their children after the deceased. So this all leads to the theory that the S in Theodora's name stands for Sunny, and Sunny Baudelaire was named after her. Now, it would make sense as she was Bertrand's old VFD chaperone. But on the darker side of things, if we follow this theory, and we realize that there's not really a mention of Theodora in the mainline series, it stands to reason she might be deceased. Now, just to play devil's advocate here, there are other theories out there, and in interviews when Handler was asked what the S means, all he had to say is this: it's right there in the text. And there are some pretty interesting choice quotes throughout the series. Take, for example, this quote, "It was a mystery like what the S stood for in Theodora's name. I kept walking with nothing but solitude for company. Solitude is a fancy name for being all by yourself. It's not a bad name, I thought." It was all training. Now, there is a theory that literally everything in the series of unfortunate events was in fact training the children for the VFD. So this wild theory suggests that the Baudelaire parents faked their deaths to put their kids through this intense training program to join VFD, and Olaf was secretly the person in charge of their tests. Now, obviously, not everything in this theory adds up, especially with what we now know about how VFD handles training from All the Wrong Questions. But it is kind of interesting because it would explain why VFD seems so distant and uninvolved with the plight of the children. It's like they're watching from the sidelines, waiting to see if the kids pass or fail. Lemony Snicket is not the good guy. Okay, so on the surface, Lemony seems like he's one of the only people to care about the Baudelaire orphans. But what if Lemony is not as reliable of a narrator as he paints himself out to be? Beneath this facade of a sorrowful, world-weary author lies a deeply flawed character. Lemony loves to portray himself as this tragic figure consumed by grief over the loss of Beatrice, but is this all a carefully constructed image? In fact, if you look at this, his obsession with the kids could even be a form of remorse for killing their parents, either indirectly or directly. I mean, no one gets a 200-page breakup letter for no reason, and rather than honoring Beatrice's decision, he goes on and perpetuates a narrative of his own victimhood. Plus, just his obsession with misery can come across as a bit self-indulgent. Then there's his actions in the books themselves. I mean, he was there in the penultimate peril. It's been confirmed that he was the taxi driver, and of course the children made their own decisions, which is good, but he was there, he could have helped them. Now, going beyond that, it's heavily hinted that Lemony was, for lack of a better word, stalking the Baudelaire orphans, and it's heavily implied he was the one taking photos of them during their misadventures, all the while not actually helping them. In this take, ultimately, Lemony is an unreliable narrator whose perspective is clouded by personal grief, and we should definitely view his narrative with a critical eye. VFD, the good side, killed the Baudelaire parents. So this is a really interesting theory that's been floating around that VFD, the good guy's side, might actually be responsible for the Baudelaire parents' deaths. The basic idea is that they wanted to recruit the kids, but the parents were trying to keep them out of the organization. So VFD decided to take drastic measures. Now, to make this theory work, you do have to ignore some of the story details, but it's still interesting to think about. VFD ended up burning down the Baudelaire mansion, which forced the kids to join the organization, basically creating the orphans they were supposed to protect. Now, Lemony Snicket seems very bitter and angry in the books, which makes you wonder if he knows the truth about what VFD did. That being said, you really do have to wonder if VFD was so desperate for new recruits that they could take such extreme measures. But at the end of the day, it is interesting because going back to the fire, in a way, it's extremely possible and even likely someone from at least one side of the VFD started it. At the end of the day, it's easy to spiral on this and how ambiguous the series is. There's no shortage of potential candidates and shady figures. And in fact, some people think it's the sinister couple who started the fire. And even beyond that, some people have theorized it was in fact Lemony himself who started the fire. Now, speaking of Lemony, Violet is Lemony's daughter. Now, it's no secret that Lemony and Beatrice were close, and the timing for this isn't as far-fetched as it may seem. Beatrice met and married Bertrand in the short period after her breakup with Lemony, so maybe her and Lemony had breakup cuddles, if you will, which resulted in Violet. Now, this would explain a good amount of stuff. Lemony is extremely devoted to the Baudelaire children, and especially Violet. Now, maybe this is because she just reminds him so much of Beatrice, but it's possible that this is a fatherly love. Adding to this theory, there's also how Kit treats Violet. Quote, "You look just like your father," Kit sighed. He wore the same frown whenever he was confused, although he almost never tied his hair up in a ribbon when he solved a problem. Now, this is interesting because this does sound a little bit like our beloved edgelord narrator. Now, since we're on the subject of parents, Olaf's parents. So Olaf is undoubtedly one of the most evil and sinister villains out there, but how did he become so villainous in the first place? Well, to understand that, I think we have to understand his parents a bit more. Well, I'm sad to say we actually don't know that much about them, but we can assume a few important things. Now, it's pretty much presumed that Count Olaf's title is legitimate because he seems to be a student at Wade Academy, which was mainly attended by royal children. As far as what his parents were like, well, given Count Olaf's poem reference at the end during his final moments, I think it's safe to assume that they might not have had the best relationship. But adding to the confusion is their deaths. In the books, Count Olaf's mother and father were killed at the opera performance by Beatrice and Bertrand Baudelaire with assistance from Kit. However, it's important to note that in the show, it's only Olaf's father who was killed at the opera, so it's clear the TV canon is a bit divergent, but in either event, their deaths could easily be a contributing factor to Count Olaf's hatred of the children. But then we have to ask, well, why were his parents killed or targeted in the first place? Now, people tend to either speculate it was somehow involved with the schism of VFD, or the much spicier theory that given Count Olaf was in fact aristocracy, he was probably rich, and maybe it was this wealth that was the motive behind their murders. Again, this is based on a theory by the Snicket sleuth, but this could tie into Kit's relationship with Olaf. So the theory basically goes that the Baudelaire parents helped Kit kill Olaf's parents, and then Kit essentially seduced him to steal his money. Now, this is reinforced because Kit is not exactly the paragon of virtue. Even as a kid, she had zero qualms with stealing and all the wrong questions, and even later in life, she kind of manipulated the Baudelaires by hiding so many details from them. So wow, this would put an entirely new spin on the entire series, and even Count Olaf's last words, because we have to consider the disturbing possibility that the Baudelaire fortune might actually be the leftovers of Olaf's inheritance. And if this is true, in the series of unfortunate events, all he's trying to do is get his fortune back that was stolen from him. On top of all of this, if Kit really did marry him for his fortune, this would add some serious poetic symmetry in him trying to marry Violet for the exact same reason. Super spicy, right? It's definitely one of my favorite theories. And finally, I saved one of the best for last. What's in the sugar bowl? Boom, here we are, one of the most mysterious mysteries in the series. When you think of the mysteries in a series of unfortunate events, this is the one. So I've been dying to get to the bottom of this myself, so I'm really excited. So let's start with what we know. The sugar bowl is first mentioned by Esme's squalor, and later in the series, we learn that Lemony wonders if it was necessary for him to steal it from her. Later, the sugar bowl was taken to the VFD headquarters, but it was here that the sinister duo burnt down the headquarters. The bowl was then thrown out the window and eventually went back to Lemony's possession. But backing further up in the timeline, it's well known that Esme was the original owner of the sugar bowl before Lemony stole it. Now, importantly, Esme mistakenly thought that Beatrice was the thief, and she easily could have assisted Lemony with this, it's unclear. But regardless of who did it, it was the catalyst for so many of the events that takes place throughout the series. Now, it's heavily implied that the sugar bowl is in Lemony's possession once more at the ends. But okay, I hear you say, what is actually in the thing? Well, my friends, like everything with this series, it's not that simple. Unless, of course, we take the TV show at face value, where they just come right out and say it. Kit claims inside the sugar bowl is a cure for the medusoid mycelium. However, it's important to realize that the TV is not necessarily canon with the books, and I was kind of shocked that they even included this in the show. So going back to the book series, there are a few prevailing theories out there on what's in it. So number one, it's sugar. Yeah, that's all. In multiple Q&As with Daniel Handler, when asked what's inside the sugar bowl, he replied by saying, quote, "What is usually in a sugar bowl?" Okay, so that's pretty easy, right? Number two is an interesting theory, which is that essentially VFD had a practice of hiding microphones in sugar bowls to record important conversations. And in this particular sugar bowl, it had a highly important one. So for example, this could be something that would have proven Lemony's innocence, or on the opposite side, Olaf's treachery. Another theory is that what's inside the sugar bowl is a horseradish hybrid / apple core. The general idea is that Bertrand hid a core of a bitter apple and a specimen of the horseradish hybrid, which would be a cure for the medusoid mycelium. Now, this would give a sufficiently satisfying reason for why both sides of the schism really care about the sugar bowl so much, and it's essentially the key to a super bioweapon of mass destruction, and it would also explain why adults within VFD don't like to talk about this in front of the children. But then there's the question of why would a sugar bowl be needed to house this? Couldn't it be anything? And further poking holes in this is that, as far as we're aware, Esme wasn't really involved in this plotline that much. Another theory floating around is that there actually might be multiple sugar bowls, and it kind of fits with the motif of characters mistaking the number of things. The Dumonts, the Quagmires, there's even hints of this motif in the Beatrice letters. So it would absolutely be keeping in line with the series for there to be multiple sugar bowls. It seems like almost too big of a deal to just be one thing. And this would make sense because all the characters seem to kind of want the bowl for different reasons. And Esme really wants it. Quote, "Then you know all about the sugar bowl," Esme said, "and what's inside. You know how important that thing is and how many lives were lost in the quest to find it. You know how difficult it was to find a container that could hold it safely, securely, and attractively. You know what it means to the Baudelaires and what it means to the Snickets." She took one sandaled step closer to Dewey and stretched out one silver fingernail, the one shaped like an S, until it was almost poking him in the eye. "And you know," she said in a terrible voice, "that it is mine." So going beyond that, there's also another spicy little theory that the sugar bowl is actually empty, like completely. Maybe at one point it did hold a cure or something else, but now it's long gone. And here's the kicker: nobody wants to admit that they don't know what's inside anymore. It's almost like a massive ego thing. So to back this up, Captain Wittershins seems both ashamed and horrified at his daughter finding out what's contained inside it. And what would be more shameful than to reveal to your children that, in fact, your family and many people they loved had died in pursuit of something completely meaningless? And I think a lot of the characters, at least in the books, just want it because that's the only way they can find out what's actually inside the thing. But at the end of the day, the point is that it doesn't really matter. It's just a plot device. Okay, there you have it, the series of unfortunate events, Iceberg. It was a ton of fun to do, and also, wow, so much. This was definitely a rabbit hole, and I'm really sorry I wasn't able to go into every single theory, so if I missed one of your favorites, I'm sorry. Maybe in the future, I'll do another one. Now, just to give a few more quick bonus additions, these are ones that I don't think there's too much to back them up or that there was just a reason to dive into them with too much detail, but here are a few. One is that Violet and Klaus are in love. Two is that Count Olaf had ulterior motives from just revenge or fortune and was basically interested in Violet. And three, the island in the end, the location, is actually given in a tragic treasury song, Shipwrecked. The latitude is 0 and the longitude is apparently 8, which is pretty cool. But what are your theories? Do you think there's anything I could have added on the ones I gave? Aside from that, I just want to give a huge shout out again to the Snicket Sleuth, which was a huge source for this, and I would really recommend checking them out. On that note, I also want to give a huge shout out to 667 Dark Avenue. That's another blog that was super helpful when crafting this. And of course, I want to give another gigantic shout out to all the people on Reddit who helped me with this. I'm going to link a few of their handles here because you guys were awesome, and the fact checking was a gigantic help. One more, and maybe the most important shout out I want to give, is to my patrons who keep this channel alive and possible. If you want to find out more ways to support the channel, you can check out the link in the description below. And as always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please let me know. Aside from that, thank you so much again, and I'll see you next time. Bye.